Tortoise is a newsroom that believes in slowing down to make sense of the world. And on Tortoise News, you get 3 shows that do just that. The Sense Maker brings you one story every day to make sense of the world. Journalists and special guests debate what should lead the news on the news meeting. And in Trendy, Britain's leading polling expert John Curtis and policy guru Rachel Wolfe explore trends in society and public opinion. Make sense of the world by searching for Tortoise News in your podcast app.
Welcome to Global Insights on the Lead, a podcast from New Lines magazine. I'm Kwangu Liwewe. The recent Euro 2024 soccer tournament provided a spectacular showcase of African talent, where players of African descent demonstrated their extraordinary abilities on one of the world's biggest stages. From Spain's dynamic duo of Lamine Yamal and Nico Williams, who linked up to put Spain ahead in the final, to England's Bukayo Saka, whose crucial goals took his team to the final, these players left an indelible mark on the success of the tournament. Just days after Spain won the trophy, some of those same players of African origin found themselves in the spotlight as the victims of racist chanting by players of the Copa America winning Argentina side. Enzo Fernandez, who plays for English club Chelsea, live-streamed the Argentinian players during their celebrations, singing a chant denigrating French players of African origin, prompting the French Soccer Federation to file a complaint to FIFA, the global soccer governing body. The racist chanting by Argentina players was far from the only incident of players of African origin experiencing racism outside the African continent. England legend Ian Wright drew attention to the increased scrutiny and racism faced by black players on the England squad after a significant loss. Earlier this year, Real Madrid and Brazil superstar Vinicius Jr., whose mother is of Congolese descent, broke down in tears at a press conference while responding to a question on whether his struggle against racism might impact his football. Well, to help me unpack these issues, I'm joined by Ponga Liwewe, who is a soccer analyst and contributor to New Lines magazine. But first, I speak to Nigeria's legendary player, Segun Odegbami, fondly known as the mathematician, for his precision and tactics on the pitch, who guided Nigeria to their first Africa Cup of Nations win in 1980. Segun, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Segun, the makeup of soccer teams has changed hugely since you played the game. The Spanish national team won their first European trophy in 1964 when you were a teenager, and that team was overwhelmingly a white squad. Now their star players have origins in Africa. How do you think it impacts young players to see such players dominate the game nowadays?
Well, it gives in this global, now very global football economy and industry, it gives young Africans the hope, the inspiration, and shows them the possibility of what they can achieve through the game of football. And I think it is the main reason why we have this flood of migration now. Some of us believe that football's power transcends any other thing you can consider in life generally, if only we know how to exploit it. Its followership is huge. The business is huge. The incentives are massive. And their add-on effects, particularly for us in Africa, are such that there's too much attraction for us to go out there and hope that we can we can compete and we can achieve the ultimate possible through football.
You also played your whole career for the Nigerian club Shooting Stars. Now, nowadays, you've just talked about some of the push factors for African players to move abroad. Higher salaries, advanced training facilities, they get great medical care, and of course, visibility and exposure. Would you say it is a pipe dream to think Africa has any pull factors to retain their own players?
We just have to look towards South America that has had through the past decades, if not even more, hundreds of years, this huge pool of exceptional talent in South America, and a lot of them keep migrating to Europe. But that has not truly affected football in South America. So the same thing with us here in Africa. Yes, during our time, the migration to Europe was in trickles or none at all. But these days, the opportunities are legion and everybody can see it. It's just there for you to go out there and grab. African countries are just generating more and more, very gifted players, and the movement to Europe continues. So, first of all, it will help Africa. It will not diminish the industry in Africa. As more of them migrate to Europe, and I tell you, as far as I know, Africa is the better for it. Africa is the better for it. The huge salaries in Europe, the opportunities, the training facilities, and so on. A few African countries are trying to replicate them now. If you look towards Egypt and you look at Morocco and South Africa, there are just a few of them who are trying to bring to Africa what is available abroad. And the rest of them, unfortunately, cannot match yet. But it's a huge industry. It's a global industry. And it doesn't harm, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't harm Africa in any way that we have this flood of African players who are going to the lucrative markets of Europe. I think it encourages us here, it challenges us here, it gives us a model to want to copy here in Africa. And some of us have started already. So it's a win-win as far as I'm concerned. It's a win-win for Africa.
So you've highlighted that it's a global industry, that football transcends many things, but there's one contentious issue, and that is racism. The topic of players of African origin facing racist abuse, this is still making headlines. Did you notice a different reception from fans when you were playing at home in Nigeria compared to when you represented the country at international tournaments?
Racism is as old as the human race. It has always been there. And unfortunately for us in Africa, at least in our history books, we know that in the past 500 years or slightly less, we have suffered seriously from racism. So it is in our DNA, more or less, to suffer this injustice that is racism. And I don't think that isolating football and thinking that racism would not exist there would be realistic. In all spheres of our lives, racism exists. And that indeed, football is one area that has been trying through the years, but without success, to eliminate racism in the game. And this is because the biggest perpetrators are also those who are ruling the game. So to enforce any directives, because that's the best they can do, any directives or any rules becomes almost impossible. But I think we have made tremendous progress, that the body like FIFA actually set up a body to look into how to reduce or eliminate racism from the game speaks volumes. But so far, because we have been handling it as individuals, it is the individuals that are affected, that cry out, and the responses are dealt with on an individual basis, limited to either the club or to the federation, and not making it a truly global affair, has not helped to take it as fast as it should. I mean, the elimination of the reduction of racism in this game. We need to do what we did in 1976 when apartheid reared its head. And for the first time, 27 African countries rose up as one to say, no, we would not accept this. And they paid for it when they were sent out of the Olympic Games. But you see, the product was that 27 African countries were missing from the games. Some of the best athletes in the world were missing from the games. That was a collective thing that was done. It was not handled on an individual basis. So unless we come as a front, a united front as nations, and make it diplomatic and pursue this cause of racism in football and in fact in other sports, then we will have to live with this situation where it is handled on an individual basis, a few fans are penalized, a few clubs are reprimanded, and then there's general talk about it. Posters are pasted everywhere, but it continues to sustain. We have to take it seriously as a people. The problem of racism is beyond what one player can champion and hope to succeed. 500 years of our lives has convinced us, has told us, and continues to tell us that it is not going to work that way. It's not going to be possible. And you can see that individual players have tried on their own to raise the issues. They have become, international subjects of discourse. They have mobilized people to do bits and pieces here and there. They have carried banners during games and so on. But it continues to succeed. Racism is in the DNA of the human being. So to remove it will take more than just the individual reacting.
Now, let's look at the many players of African origin. They've spent very little time on the continent, or indeed some of them haven't even been there because their parents or grandparents might have immigrated to Europe or Latin America many generations back. Do you think these players still have a level of pride in their roots?
Well, it will depend on the player. It will depend on his history. It will depend on the level of indoctrination. It will depend on where he was born, or even his culture within the community he grows up in. In the same vein, where you find a player who goes to Europe and chooses to come back to Africa, so also do you find players who go to Europe and choose to stay in Europe. So it depends on the individual players and how, of course, they evolve. Some of them are supported by their adopted countries to become who they are, and their connection to their roots may not be as solid as those who were born, who suffered, went through the mill. It is not the same thing with Mbappe. Mbappe spent all his life in France, has given his life to France. Although he has come to the Cameroon to visit, but his commitment is more to France. So it depends on a lot of factors. So many of our players in Nigeria, for example, don't even connect with the country after their careers. Whereas there are a few that will come back and want to connect with their communities. They're building hospitals, they're building schools, they're doing all manner of things. Whereas others will choose to live in Europe, within the luxurious space of Europe, and spend their lives. But as an African, someone who spent all his career in Africa, who has beyond that become a diplomatic ambassador of Africa, I would just urge that all Africans, all peoples of African descent, either in the diasporan Africans or those that are born there, and so on, it's so important that we reconnect with our roots, with our source. Africa is our home, whether you like it or not. For as long as you have that black blood in you, you can never be first rate. And history has shown it abroad. So you must look back at Africa.
But on an individual basis, if you look at that player, it must be very difficult for them to balance who to play for. Because on the one hand, they've got their adopted country and their country of origin. Let's say, for instance, both countries make it to the World Cup. Surely they have to look at the chances of them, the player, being selected, and also who's going to let them play on the field in that tournament on a regular basis.
It will depend on the player, really. It will depend on the player. I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, our Nigerian players went to Côte d'Ivoire. They got to the finals of AFCON. And when they came, they didn't win AFCON. They came back to the country and they were all given national honors. They were all given plots of land. They were all given houses in Nigeria. The rewards they collected, not for winning, for getting to the finals, there's no other country in the world that would have done that. No other country would have done that. But this is Africa. You see, so it depends on the circumstances. You live in Europe, you go to the World Cup and you play and you win. It is certain what you get. In Africa, it is possible you even get a lot more than that, and you impact on your people and your society and your community. So it all depends on the athlete. It depends on the footballer, how he perceives of himself, the role that he thinks he can play in this world, and particularly this world that we are in now, where somebody like Mandela says that we need to come as a common front as Black people. We need to come as a common front as Black people. We need to earn that respect. We need to sit on the table of civilization to be able to ask for equity in this world. So if I were in their shoes and we go to the World Cup and my adopted country is whatever, and my own country is whatever, it is up to me to take a decision, but I would definitely choose to stay with my African roots.
Just to take you back on a point you just made, it. Let me see if I got you clearly. If you were a young player today, would you have looked to play for a club outside of Africa?
Without hesitation. Without hesitation. If you're a young boy, the place to go as early as possible, considering the circumstances that exist in this world now, is to head to the lucrative markets of Europe in particular. Or you go to Asia, but particularly Europe. That's where to go. That's a stepping stone. Even where you have great dreams for yourself and your community and your people, that's where to go. The facilities are there, the wages are there, the technical requirements can be fulfilled in Europe, the opportunities to play at the highest level are in Europe. It just makes sense. If I was a young boy, I would head to Europe. Yet, I will not forget my roots. After I have conquered in Europe, I would come back and give to my society and build my society, because that's the whole essence of it.
Segun, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
That was Segun Odegbami in Nigeria. We now move to Ponga Liwewe. Ponga is a journalist who has written extensively about soccer and its relationship with Africa. He is the current CEO of Zambian club Napsa Stars and previously served as Secretary General of the Football Association of Zambia. Ponga, welcome to the podcast.
A pleasure to be here.
So now let's start with the just ended Euro 2024 tournament. For you, what were the standout moments with regards to the performances of players of African origin in this competition?
I think without doubt you have to look at the performance of Spain, who eventually became champions. It was tough competition. It showed that they have the quality. And when you look at the wonder sensation of the tournament was the 16-year-old who had his birthday when he turned 17 at the tournament itself, Lamine Yamal. He was a standout player, of course, and he, of course, has parents from Africa. His father was from Morocco, and his mother also from Africa. And then you look at Nico Williams, who is of Ghanaian origin. So I think those two really stood out as, showcasing what African players, in inverted commas, because of course they're playing for Spain. But he did show the young Lamal, and of course Nico Williams did show his quality in that tournament. So you have to say those were the standout guys. And then of course, when you look at the French team, I think as far back as 1998, when they won the World Cup for the first time, the influence of African players then was so much prevalent. I mean, that time they had the likes of Patrick Vieira, Zidane, just to mention a few, Claude Makelele. Probably 90% of the team were black players, and of that 90%, probably about 80% had African roots. So you have to say that the players from Africa have made a huge impact in European.
That's interesting. Now, why, in your opinion, are European countries extensively tapping into these players of African origins? For instance, is there a link between young kids being from an immigrant background and finding success in the game?
I think when you look at the most successful players in world football, not only African, but those who have risen to the top, it tends to be players who come from disadvantaged background. And being an African in Europe is never easy. And it shows you that there are even more difficulties because of the color of their skin to get into positions where they can make an impact in life. I mean, the opportunities are just not there. And sport, and particularly football, is an avenue that gives a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to young Black African players to showcase. I mean, when you look at the number of North Africans also coming through France, coming through Spain, their disadvantages in where they grew up, where they went to school, curtails other opportunities. But on the sports field, it's your talent that speaks for you. And this is one of the reasons why African players have been able to shine at the higher levels of the game in Europe. And then also you look at the flair and the spontaneity that they bring on the field. I mean, when you look at European players, sometimes you will see that their play is a little bit regimented, a little bit almost choreographed. But when you look at the African way of playing football, particularly if you come to the continent, you will see players who have flair, who have talent, who are able to showcase what they want to do. And this is something that has been carried on from one generation to the next. So that ability to do the unexpected is what makes African players special.
Well, that's interesting. Now, can you paint a picture for us why players of African origin might choose to play for the country they grew up in, that's their adopted country, or the other choice is the country in which they might have roots? If we look at the current Nigerian captain, William Troost-Ekong, he grew up in England in a mixed Dutch and Nigerian family. What are the factors that might influence a player like him to choose which country to play for? There's been a lot of debate about this.
Yeah, I think you have to look at it from several dimensions. When you look at players of African origin playing in Europe, it's not always the case that they will be given the platform or the opportunity. And there are so many. So firstly, if you don't have the opportunity to play for the country you are born in, you still have the second option of playing where your roots came from. So that opens up doors. There's also a Zambian player, for example, called Frankie Musonda, who plays in Scotland. I don't think he would get into the Scottish national team, but he's more than good enough to play for Zambia. So there he is. He's won the national shirt and he's won it with pride. So you have to say that opportunity is one of the factors. And then you also have to look at, where is your heart attached? That also does have a bearing. Some players will say, look, I was born in England, I lived in England, my heart is in England, I've never been to Africa, and choose not to play for an African country. But if your heartstrings are attached, and of course, I look at some of the players. I mean, I was talking about the Williams brothers. The other brother of Nico, Inaki, plays for Ghana. He spoke about how his grandfather said to him, I would really love to see you play for the national team. And there it is. He didn't have the chance to play in Spain, Inaki, but there he is. He's been playing for the Ghana Black Stars while his brother is playing for Spain. So those are some of the issues that will determine what goes through a player's mind when he makes that decision.
So for an African player based in Africa, what are the push factors for them to want to go play for Europe or other international teams?
Well, I think the European platform is definitely much bigger. When you get a chance, for example, to play in the English Premiership, what bigger showcase do you have than that for your talent? And then, of course, if you've been there long enough and eligible to play for one of the European teams, if you do get that opportunity, I mean, you really want to be at the highest level, at the biggest platform. And that's why you will find more and more players who have made that trip from Africa to Europe have opted for the European option. But then it's also has its own benefits. I mean, when you look at the commercial aspects of football, if you are wearing an English flag on your chest and you are English, then obviously the commercial opportunities would be much, much more than if you go there as a Ghanaian player or a Nigerian player or even a Zambian player. Your commercial value to those companies doesn't really have that much impact when you're coming from an African country. They'll always go for their own to represent their brands and, of course, their own to showcase what the country has done and what the companies are doing and what they want to achieve from a marketing perspective. So it's really, really a case of what opportunities are there when you wear the English flag versus a Zambian flag or a Ghanaian flag or a French flag. Commercially, it's definitely a much greater opportunity for a player if he's of that nationality, and it means much more for them to make commercial revenue.
Okay. Now, I want you to talk a little bit about the historical colonial ties. I know you did mention that briefly. Just tell us how these influence the pathways for African soccer players into European leagues, because mainly when we look at the list, we see players coming from French-speaking African countries or their background is from there and they end up playing for the French national team. Just talk about this historical colonial ties, and as well as the Arab North teams. Do we see them also going to the Arab leagues, or they concentrate with the European leagues?
Well, I think for every player, before you even get to your national teams, to play on the biggest stages. And without doubt, Europe is the biggest stages for any footballer, irrespective of where you come from. If you get to play on those leagues or in those leagues, it's really an opportunity to showcase to millions and millions of audiences on TV that you are there and capable of doing it. So that's really the opportunity every single player looks for. And of course, once you get there, you have to deliver your best. You have to give your best. You have to show that what you're capable of if you are to continue to have a contract to play there. So that is one of the driving forces of players wanting to go to Europe. You look at, I give an example of Leroy Sané, who of course plays in Germany. His father, Souleymane Sané, came from Senegal, played for the Senegal national team, played in France, had the opportunity to grow up in Europe. And there is his son, born in Europe and playing now for the German national side. And he's played in Man City, he's played in Bayern. I mean, what bigger platform would a player look for then? To play for such prestigious sides and, of course, to play for Germany, a team which is virtually guaranteed to go to every World Cup, versus being in an African country where you may or may not qualify. So when you look at the colonial strings, of course, France is probably got the largest contingent of African players. But look at the French colonialism. They kept very strong ties with the countries they ruled in, which is why you will find a strong West African presence in French football, because along the West African coast was a lot of French colonization, as well as in the North African parts of football. I mean, you just have to look at Zinedine Zidane of Algerian descent, and he has then gone on to become the greatest French player ever, and one of the greatest ever in the world of football. And it's not the same, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, for the countries colonized by Britain, because those strong ties didn't go to that level as the French kept their ties with their colonial countries. And in the English-speaking parts, you will find, yes, a sprinkling of players here and there. Maybe Nigeria is an exception, but the sprinkling, and maybe Ghana also, but a sprinkling of countries, players from the likes of Kenya, Zambia, South Africa, not that many, because those ties, for example, are not on the level that the French have used their relationships with their former colonies to further their achievements.
You must have seen the racist abuse directed at the French players of African origin by Argentina at the Copa America just a few days after the Euro 2024 final. What was your reaction to that?
I mean, it's a really sad state of affairs that a country's national team, a team flying the flag of Argentina, would then go and behave in such a manner, because it doesn't only reflect on football, but it reflects on Argentina as a country. So there's been widespread condemnation of this kind of conduct. And of course, if you look at the Euro before this one, we had 3 Black English players missed penalties, and when England lost that final, there was a huge amount of abuse channeled towards those players by the English public. So you have so many situations, African players on the field, bananas thrown at them, all sorts of insults, all sorts of songs against them. You know, it's really a disgrace. But I was talking to a friend of mine who served on the task force for FIFA against racism. This was a task force that was formed by Sepp Blatter, the previous FIFA president. And then when Infantino came in and took over, unfortunately, that task force was disbanded. But nothing has changed. I mean, yes, we get all the widespread condemnation verbally, but as long as strong action is not taken, for example, a player who abuses another should be banned from football for a number of games. A venue where that sort of behavior has become commonplace should be banned from holding games. But none of that strong action that would really have an impact has been taken. And therefore, we find that, you know, despite years and years of talking about racism in football, nothing has changed. These things are still happening.
And do you think the increasing visibility of these African players of origin mean that racism in the game is generally more or less of an issue?
I think racism is a reflection of the whole society. You wouldn't take it out in isolation, just looking at sport, because I think cultures have changed towards foreigners, towards Black people. I think there's been a wholesale change in how people of African origin or Black people are perceived in Europe. I think there's been a toning down. Obviously, with time and engagement, people have begun to accept that, these are people just like us. And of course, that toning down at society level has also filtered down to the football level. And therefore, you can say when the likes of John Barnes was playing in Liverpool in the 80s or for Watford in the late 70s, it was horrendous. Today, some of the things they were doing then you wouldn't see in public, but it's still there. I would say there has been a reduction in racism, but it hasn't been cleaned enough to the extent that we would love it to be cleaned. And therefore, it's the onus falls on football bodies, the people who run football, the people who lead football, to make the decisions that will ensure that this thing is stamped out completely. I mean, if it's not possible, it should be stamped out to a much greater extent.
Now, broadly, finally, I just want to find out from you, do you think in terms of FIFA, should they have any ethical considerations when they look at countries that actively recruit talent from the diaspora or former colonies? And this goes back to our question about loyalty to your to the country you're coming from.
Yeah, well, I think, look, we're in a global environment now. And I recall in my youth, there was a lot of nationalism. It was almost impossible sometimes, even for a player playing outside your country. If you looked at in the late 70s, early 80s, just not playing in your country was enough for a player not to be called up to his national team. Still does happen in some of the sports. But I think we're in a global environment and the rules have changed over globalization. So I think it has become the norm that a player can be born in Ghana but play for France or vice versa. I think that is the reality of life in today's world. And FIFA, yes, they had stricter rules in the past, but would you say it was a good thing? That's questionable. I mean, some of the countries would call up a player of African origin, give him one game at youth level, and then thereafter he's tied to that country. So they wanted to ensure that any player who comes through will play for their country. And then when they give you one game, they'll never give you another opportunity. And then you've played one youth game in your career and you can't have another international game. So therefore, FIFA have twinkled with the rules a bit and said, at youth level, if you've played, you can then, as long as you haven't played at the highest senior level, you can then switch your allegiance to another country. Therefore, players are no longer being blocked by the fact that they played one youth game for a European country and can't now play anywhere else. So those are some of the pros and cons. At least today's players will get the opportunity. If you haven't played here or you haven't played in Europe, you can then have the opportunity, if you are young enough and if you meet the requirements, you can play for another country. So I think it opens it up for the players to have more opportunities rather than fewer opportunities.
Ponga, thank you very much for your insights.
Always a pleasure. You're welcome.
This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you'll find global insights the last Friday of every month. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please rate us and leave a review. It really helps us to grow our audience. Thanks for joining us.